Good evening. Now, you remember back in 2015, the Modi government introduced a new method of the calculation of the country's GDP. The method changed two things. First, it changed the base year, which is the year you compare today's growth with. The base year used to be 2004-05. They changed it to 2011-12. And this resulted in the average GDP growth of the previous government coming down and the GDP growth of this government becoming significantly higher. And the move came under some criticism, but it was largely asked and answered mostly by politicians. Now, what we found out today is far, far worse. The other change that happened in the method of calculating GDP was a change in the database of companies that was used to measure the GDP. Now, you'll have to give me a minute to explain this. GDP is a measure of the total value of goods and services that our country has produced in 1 year. To find that out, you need to find the volume of finished goods and services and multiply that with the market price, and you will get the total output. And to do that, you need to use a database of companies, and you need to call them up and find out what their output was for the year. The biggest contribution to India's GDP is the services sector. And in earlier calculations, for the services sector, we used to use the RBI data on company finances. But when that change was made, it was changed to a different database called the MCA21. This is a database that's sourced from the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Now, this is where we are today. In a report that came out from the NSSO, yes, same organization that put out the jobs data that was withdrawn from the government. This report, this survey from the NSSO shows that a large number of the companies in the new database are, well, dodgy. The NSSO surveyed 35,000 companies from a total database of 3.5 lakh. Of this, 37% of the companies were either not traceable or they were wrongly classified. That's a third of that database. 20% were found to be out of coverage, which means they were likely no longer even operating in the services sector. 15% of these firms were either untraceable or had closed down completely, and 7% of the companies, if they were correctly identified, just didn't respond to survey questions at all. So 1/3 of the companies were not responsive. And this really makes us question the GDP numbers now. Because if 1/3 of these companies were not reachable or they were not traceable, how did the CSO find out what their output was for the year? Are they making the whole thing up now? Now, experts say this means our GDP data is either not reliable or not credible. And this matters a great deal. It has nothing to do with the election. It matters a great deal because investors across the world rely on this data to make investment decisions about India. And we don't want to be among those countries that fudge their national data. Global investors, if they begin to doubt us, and if that hasn't happened already, will really, really hurt our economy. The government, of course, has clarified, based on that report. They basically said, and the clarification is very weak really, it said the NSSO report was commissioned by the ministry in order to take remedial steps and fill in any gaps in the annual survey of industries. It also goes on to say that this matter will be examined by a special committee, and this has no impact whatsoever on the existing GDP estimates. The question we're asking is this: does this raise serious questions about our GDP data? If it does that mean the real data is higher or considerably lower? And if that's the case, will India lose face before the global investors in the global markets for fudging data and making things look better than they really are? Fundamentally, is our economy in worse trouble than we thought it was? Joining me on the show, Gopal Agarwal, the spokesperson of the BJP, Professor Santosh Mehrotra of JNU, Ashutosh is a senior journalist, Mr. Mohan Guruswamy is a senior economist, and he was the former advisor to the finance minister, Yashwant Sinha, and of course, Ajay Dua, former commerce secretary. We'll also have Mr. Chidambaram join us on the phone line in a little while when we get through to him. But opening statements from all of our guests. Mr. Dua, good evening. I will start with you. Mr. Dua, how concerning is this for you? Because if the global market starts to believe that perhaps our GDP numbers are not reliable, what will that mean for India?
It's what has been revealed yesterday is certainly a matter of concern, that the NSSO itself is pointing out that the MCA 21 data upon which we have relied upon the state of the services sector has over a third of the units surveyed to be non-existent, closed down business, or are dummy units, or are in businesses other than what the data had captured them for. It certainly is, we need to worry about it, and it also has impact, clearly a clear impact on our estimation of the GDP. Having said that, please allow me to say that the problem with respect to our GDP data has been persisting for quite some time. It isn't something which cropped up only in 2015 when the 2011-12 was taken as the base. You might recall that earlier in 1999-2000, when the government or the governmental organization, the CSO at that point of time, had come out with the national income estimation, and that's the responsibility given to the CSO. That point of time, the economists had questioned that the consumption expenditure was rather low, but at the same time, the government was claiming that the level of poverty in the country had come down considerably, because that was being linked to the estimate of the national income. Thereafter, we've seen problems with respect to not only poverty reduction claims, but also with respect to how to estimate the contribution of the industry by itself, organized sector. Earlier it was based on an RBI sample survey. Thereafter we moved to MCA 21.
Yes, yes.
And the role of industries which are within the state sector, that is getting underestimated according to the present scheme of things. And finally, we've always had a problem with respect to the informal sector contribution. We've been applying the yardstick of, if the organized industry is growing at a particular rate, apply the same rate of growth to the informal sector. And informal sector, as we know in India, is pretty large. So any mistake made with respect to the formal sector magnifies itself when we start looking at the estimate of informal sector. So there are a lot of things in our data which need to be corrected, and those have been persisting for some time. We'll probably later on talk about how to go about rectifying some of these persisting errors in our data estimation.
Right. I do want to understand. I do want to understand this, Mr. Guruswamy. Do you believe, and I think this is important for our audience to understand, do you believe that a 37%, list of companies that are not perhaps traceable or reachable, could that have been an error on the part of the CSO that calculates the GDP? Or do you think it would have been a deliberate attempt to inflate our GDP numbers?
It's a dining, my wife.
No, I don't think it would have been a deliberate attempt. I think it was just incompetence. They were tampering with something which was well established. We were getting our data from the RBI. We were stuck with it. The MCA, Ministry for Company Affairs, is not a particularly reliable and upright kind of department. All kinds of things happen. There are all kinds of bogus companies. Out of the 1.8 million registered companies in India, 660,000 are non-existent or don't function. So this data kind of, the sample therefore tallies with that, 38.7 tallies with that, which means that, you recording data and showing as growth as actual output to companies which don't exist. So to that extent, your data well is now poisoned. You can't trust this data. You should have stuck with the RBI. This is, trying to be much too clever by half. The new government came. They were not comfortable with the old regime, who they tossed out with the massive attack, saying that there are no jobs, there's no, and there's no, the growth has fallen down. We're actually posting a growth of 8% over that period. So they wanted to show it in bad light. So they accepted, after all, the government has to accept the new methodology. They accepted this very fast, without understanding the implications of what they were doing. I don't think Mr. Jaitley understood it then, nor do they understand it now. And they did it. So we are in trouble. Today, the worldwide, there was respect for India's data collection, India's statistics. Now that whole thing is under question. Will the rating agencies abroad trust us now? Will the multilateral agencies trust us? Will the foreign investment companies trust us? The data itself, you've poisoned the whole well now. As a result, to get out of this, to build a credible data system, to build credibility into our data, is going to be a major effort.
Gopal Agarwal, one, GDP will actually be, or could actually be a lot lower than we think it is. Secondly, if we are going to lose our reputation in front of global investors, how will we recover it? What's the plan?
Faye, because you have many panelists who will be criticizing the whole current government, I would request you to give me sufficient time. I would like to mention some of the important points that I think are important in this debate. Okay. One thing is that when you are saying that the current government changed the base year from 2004 to 2012, I would ask you one question: how the base year has become 2004 and not 1947? So this change of base year is a continuous periodical process which takes place. So there is nothing out of the blue that 2004 base year was changed to 2011-12. It has been changed in the past. It had been changed this time also. Second thing is, what I want to tell you is, cleaning of data is a continuous process. You do it every time. If earlier there were 2.5 lakh companies which were shell companies, and it is our effort over this 4-5 years that this 2.5 lakh companies which were completely shell companies not existing were deregistered. So it is this whole corporate sector data was being cleaned at various point of time. Third thing is that it is always considered good that change of data from surveys to administrative data is across the globe considered to always it is better. So when NSSO tried to change the data from the RBI survey report to administrative MCA data, that would have been a better process of getting access to the data. And on the MCA 21 data, I am telling you that we have done lot of effort to upgrade the ROC data with including Infosys by Institute of Corporate Affairs. I have been personally involved into upgrading this data. Institute of Company Secretaries, all were involved, and keeping it online, creating directors, DIN number, TIN number, creating a database. All these things, audit trail, were involved to create a better ecosystem of data with regard to corporate company structure and administratively improve the data of the corporate sector. Next thing is, I want to tell you is the use of MCA data was there is a press release by the government which says that the data of MCA used by NSSO was corrected after being used. So wherever there are deviations, standard deviation to the things, were those statistical methods was involved into correcting of the data which came from these administrative services. So the quality of data, I don't deny that the quality of data in the current situation is always a problem. But that has not been just suddenly, this time it has arrived. It's a continuous process, and there was problem. And I want to tell, before I answer another question or we continue, is Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, when he changed the definition of poverty, how he changed that 39 rupees a day expenditure is that kind of definition he changed from the calculation of poverty from rural and urban areas. That 40 paisa you invest on
what's your point about Mr.
milk,
Agarwal?
then you are above poverty line. So he created a new definition of poverty line. Change the way.
What does that have to do with what we're talking about today?
By the urban population. That time I don't remember the figure. So no, there are changes in the data.
Okay. So Mr. Ahluwalia did it, so you can also do it. That's the argument.
I'm telling you that cleaning of data is a continuous process. No, I'm not telling. I'm telling you that why our base year is not 1947 now, why it was 2004. You ask.
No, I didn't actually. That's not what I asked at all.
In your panel,
in fact, I had in fact in my introduction said very clearly that the base year argument was largely political because it was mostly political criticism and it was answered also by politicians. My question is the comfort level that the government has, and it seems from Mr. Gopal Agarwal's answers that the government has a tremendous level of comfort with 39% companies being shell companies, not traceable, and actually these companies in some way contributing to our GDP data. How can you measure the output of a company that doesn't exist or is not in the address that it says it is or is not traceable in any way? So what has the CSO measured and put out? That's the question we are asking. So I want to take the question now. No, Mr. Agarwal, we heard you out, Mr. Agarwal.
The report from RBI were completely correct. Yes.
No, Mr. Agarwal, that's not an argument. Saying that was rubbish, so we've got more rubbish is not an argument. My question is, do you have a comfort level at 39%?
No. We are trying to improve it.
How are you trying to improve it? 39%, are you comfortable with that number?
Not at all.
Okay, all right.
We are... No, I'm telling you that the ministry has come out with a press release that NSSO data report was commissioned by the Ministry of Finance and it was to improve the incompetencies on the data collection.
Okay, so I've seen the press release, Mr. Agarwal. I've seen the press release. I have it in my hand. Yes, we've heard you out. We've heard you out. I want to give the other panelists a chance to respond.
Yes, I'm not saying that we are comfortable.
Okay, all right, Mr. Agarwal, we understand Mr. Chidambaram is on the phone line. Mr. Chidambaram, good evening. This is Faye D'Souza from the Mirror Now studio. Thank you for speaking with us. We were just talking about the latest story that's come out on the possibility that our GDP numbers are not accurate. In your opinion and in your experience, what price will we have to pay in the global markets for inaccurate GDP data?
To say that they are not accurate is an understatement. You're being too kind. What the government has done is to capture the CSO or to intimidate the CSO to using bogus data. And we'll pay a heavy price. Already questions are being asked. At least one world-renowned economist in a key position has already asked one of my colleagues, are India's GDP numbers trustworthy? Can we ever trust India's numbers again? I think we'll pay a heavy price. The markets will ask for a price. The investors will ask for explanation. I think this government is playing with fire.
Mr. Chidambaram, the 37% or 39% companies that turn out to be bogus companies, could that have been human error or perhaps inefficiency or incompetence?
How can it be a human error? We demanded the MCA 21 data. We've been demanding it for nearly 2 years. Statisticians, economists have all asked for this data. When they changed the base year and when they changed the methodology and when they switched over to the MCA 21 data, there were enough protests. In fact, if I remember right, even the RBI protested because they discarded the RBI data and moved to the MCA 21 data. Ignoring all these protests, they have persisted with the MCA 21 data for 2 years. It can't be a human error. If it is a human error, it would have been noticed much earlier.
Mr. Chidambaram, in the changes that were made by the government back in 2015, they included a few things in the calculation of GDP. Government earnings in tax, for example, that wasn't calculated as part of GDP before that. They've included trade between manufacturing companies and also now this data from services. If this were to be corrected, let's assume what we found out today in the MCA data, how drastically would this alter our GDP number? Would it alter it downwards or upwards? And what would that differential be?
No question of altering it upwards. It will be downwards. You see, they changed the base year, which is not unusual. Let's leave it at that. They changed the methodology, and they never explained the methodology. The methodology was questioned by a couple of eminent statisticians. They justified it. All that is technical stuff on which only a technical group of experts can finally pronounce. Then they changed the deflators. That again is technical stuff, which only a trained economist can explain. They changed the deflators, but I remember reading a number of articles questioning and pointing out that if the deflator had been slightly different, how the GDP would have been very different. Now, the one thing that everyone understands, you and I understand, every common person understands, is you're using non-existent data. You are using data of about 35, 37% of companies which don't exist. So where is this turnover? Where is the profit? Where is the output? And you're counting the turnover or the output as part of GDP. I mean, it's just absurd. I've never come across such a scandalous way of calculating GDP. They used to say this about another country, but I think that other country has mended its ways and it's become more credible. And we, who pride ourselves in our Indian Statistical Institute and being among foremost countries which pride in our statistics, have now become the laughing stock of the world.
Mr. Chidambaram, I'm just reading out of the press release that the government has put out today, and it says, with regards to the MCA 21 data, that in 2011-12, the National Accounts Series started using corporate sector data available with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. It also says that this recent exercise from the NSSO was commissioned by the ministry, and remedial steps are being undertaken based on this exercise. It then goes on to say there is no impact at all on the existing GDP estimates. Do you agree with this press release?
Of course. How can there be no impact? If there's no impact, why are they taking remedial steps? The contradictions are so obvious in the short statement they have put out. Thank God this is an outgoing government. Whether they take remedial steps or not is irrelevant. They can't do more damage now.
And the last question, Mr. Chidambaram, the argument that the previous data that was also being used, which was the RBI data on company earnings, was also similarly flawed. Do you accept that argument?
I don't know. Nobody has pointed out the RBI data was flawed. If the RBI data was flawed, then somebody should have raised it and the RBI would have responded. What's the point of saying now that the RBI data was flawed? Today we are dealing with the CSO data. This is typical BJP diversionary tactic. Deal with the issue at hand. Don't raise ghosts which don't exist.
And finally, Mr. Chidambaram, do you believe that our economy is perhaps in far worse state than we realize or we're being allowed to understand?
It is. Just look at the Ministry of Finance's monthly report for March 2019. I addressed a press conference earlier today, and I listed all the negatives. They are not my inventions. They are simply headlines from the Ministry of Finance's report, which means that voices which were suppressed have now begun to speak up. And I think more and more people will speak up. Our economy is in poor shape. Dr. Manmohan Singh, a very reticent person, made a detailed statement 3 days ago. It's not usual for Dr. Manmohan Singh to make such a detailed statement on the economy. So let's pay attention to what he said. Let's give credence and weight to what he said, supported now by the report of the Ministry of Finance,
Yes.
further supported by the NSSO's revelations about the CSO data. I think all persons who are concerned about the economy should ask questions.
Yes.
I don't expect this government to come out with true answers, but at least if the questions are on the table, the next government will find answers.
All right. Mr. Chidambaram, thank you for
Thank
your
you.
time and helping us understand your point of view on this particular matter. Mr. Chidambaram, leader with the Congress Party and former Finance Minister of the Government of India. Going back to my panel, and I thank you for your patience as well. Professor Mehrotra, I was going to come to you with this. The number of 37% would that, in your opinion, be out of your comfort zone as a part of the sample that is unreachable or untraceable? Do you believe that that puts our GDP number perhaps under question? Professor Mehrotra?
Well, let me make 3 points in response to your question. Yeah, let me make 3 points in response to your question. I think the GDP numbers of India were under a question mark even before this MCA 21 database issue was raised. Let me give you 2 solid evidence of this. After all, an expert committee had 6 months ago come up with an estimate for GDP, which then suddenly was revised by the government, and suddenly the new revisions that the government came up with seemed to suggest that during the last 5 years, the growth rate has been higher than in the preceding 5 years, despite the fact that all the constituent indicators were telling us an opposite story. The second bit of evidence, I would say, that there were question marks earlier is the following, that for the year of the demonetization, the year in which the unorganized sector suffered a massive shock, and let's remind ourselves the unorganized sector accounts for roughly half the GDP. In that year, suddenly the GDP number was raised, and it raised to well above the previous number, so that itself raised questions. Now the MCA 20, as far as the MCA 21 database is concerned, it's, as I think Mr. Guruswamy rightly said, we should not have rushed into this. Both the panelists earlier have said to me, we should not have rushed into this. We should have also, secondly, made the database public. Many economists were asking for this database to be made public so that suddenly, we are suddenly being confronted with the results of the NSSO survey, which reveals what you have been revealing. So I think there was a mistake made, and this is point 2. And point 3 is that, to the extent the MCA is capturing organized sector data, and it's the growth in the organized sector which is then used and extrapolated for estimating the contribution of the unorganized sector to the GDP, then the mistakes in the organized sector estimates actually get compounded when you begin to sort of project that onto the unorganized sector. So these are all serious problems. And having said all this, let me say just, if you give me one more minute, if you, you see, on the MCA 21, what are the sources, the components of the 38% that you're talking about? 21% of this 38% consists of companies which are not service sector companies. So they would have hopefully got, captured somewhere else. Hopefully. I mean, honestly, CSO has to clarify this. As far as the shell companies are concerned, or the closed companies are concerned, let's just remember, shell companies means that they have zero output. So, I mean, as far as there being corrupt mechanisms being used, to create shell companies, that's a different matter. For the purposes of the calculation of the GDP is already being generated somewhere else, and these owners are being shown, meaning the owners of non-shell companies are putting money into the shell companies. But the money has already been generated, so that's getting captured. So, to that extent, I think this is not such a serious worry.
Right, I just want to extend this now.
Overall, the use of the MCA 21 data is a problem.
Okay, I just want to open Ashutosh is with us as well, and a very honest questions come from one of our viewers who said, how will this affect us in our daily lives?
30 seconds. 30
No,
seconds.
I'll come back to you, Mr. Agarwal.
Faye,
Mr. Agarwal, I'll come back to you.
seconds.
I'll come back to you. I have to give everybody one chance to speak, and then I'll come back to you.
But Mr. Chidambaram has said something. Just.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Agarwal, go ahead. 30 seconds. You'll have to make your point in 30 seconds. So go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes. GDP data will not be affected. I agree with Mr. Mehrotra, because when you are taking something into the cognizance of recording data, when the shell company which is not existent will not have any turnover, will not have any GDP growth or profit. So how it will affect the calculation into the what balance sheet will have with regard to sales, they all will be zero. So I think the quality of data is a question, but it will not affect the GDP. I agree with the government. There may be minor effect, but it will always be there in any kind of data analysis when you are taking through so many sources. But I think it will not majority really affect the GDP calculations. That has to be kept in mind, because these companies are non-existent as far as NSSO report. So they will not have any turnover, they will not have any profit, they will not have any service consultation fees, etc. That will also be zero from their balance sheets.
Okay, so I'll open this to rebuttals, and I just want to give Ashutosh an opportunity to just respond. Somebody's asked us very genuinely, how will this affect me in my daily life? Well, technically, if our GDP is far lower, it's already affecting you. It's just that the GDP number doesn't reflect what's happening in your life. But Ashutosh, for the citizens of India, this does matter, doesn't it?
No, the GDP data, if it is fast or if it is in question, then obviously Indian economy is not growing as fast as it has been claimed by the government. The point is that today this disclosure has put a question mark about the entire edifice of data. That from now onwards, every data which has been produced by the government will be suspect. Everybody will doubt these data, and so all the numbers which has been given that India is the fastest growing economy, now nobody is going to believe it. And I tell you one thing, Chidambaram is right on the point that you change the base here, nobody has a problem with that. You change the methodology, nobody has a problem. But when it is discovered that 36% of the companies are, in a way, shell companies are disappeared, and your data is based on these companies, then obviously there is something seriously wrong. This is a kind of a scam, and it should be found out that on whose instruction this scam has been done. See, today, if you look at the consumption into the rural sector is down. The auto sector is down. The Maruti sale is down by 20% in the month of April. The more than 300 car vendors have shut their shops. More than 3,000 crore has been lost by the auto sector. And service sector is down by 7 months. The issue that there is no export growth per se. It has certainly gone plateau. The unemployment is almost 45 years highest rate. Now the issue is where the economy is growing, and the government is claiming that the economy is the fastest growing economy in the world. I am willing to believe that, but can government tell me, give me the confidence that the data it is providing is true? Now onwards, I will not believe a single data given by the government.
Okay, I want to open this up to the panel right now. If you have an answer, please raise your hand so I know that you want to come in. Do you agree with the fact that this will not impact the current GDP, GVA estimates?
So tomorrow, if we say that the economy is slowing down, you will believe that data.
1 second.
No, tomorrow if
one second. Let me, Mr. Agarwal, I gave you your extra 30 seconds. Allow me to get rebuttals. Mr. Dua has put his hand up. Mr. Dua, do you agree with Mr. Agarwal that this change, if this correction is made of this 37% data, that it will not affect the current GDP estimates? Mr. Ajay Dua, please.
I don't think so. I don't think it's entirely right, for the very simple reason that the weightage of services in the Indian economy has been consistently rising. Now it's almost 55%. But in our scheme of methodology, we have not evolved any reliable, transparent system of estimating how to measure the services, moving from RBI to then to now MCA 21, without making the raw data publicly available to be able to comment upon it, without making available the report of an agency which has used that data to be commented upon. I think we are raising doubts about credibility of Indian data, be it in the area of GDP or unemployment, or for that matter, any other constituent of GDP, whether it's investment or consumption. I see no reason why the government hasn't over all these years sorted out the role of National Statistical Commission vis-a-vis the Ministry of Statistics, program implementation,
Yes.
and the Chief Statistician of India, who also is the Secretary of Ministry of MOSPI.
Okay.
The confusion is being arisen because far too many people are involved and they are working at cross paths. The Secretary of the Ministry refuses, and who's the Secretary of the Commission refuses, that's been the experience, of sharing the data or the reports which he has access to with the National Statistical Commission. What do we see? Right now, NSSO, a report which was commissioned, and a survey which was commissioned, was to come out with 2 reports based on that. But suddenly, when NSSO said that the data is unreliable, 38% of the companies who have been taken into the scheme of things, we do not know where they are, what do they do, and quite a few of them are non-existent. The government of the day, which seems to have commissioned them, said, then don't produce those 2 reports. Just give us 1 report, and a report on an entirely different thing, which is the one being commented upon since yesterday. I think we need to urgently get to the point of saying who is responsible for what, and then if uncomfortable findings come out, let's not play around with that. Because today, what are we seeing? In the top functionaries of the Niti Aayog, one of them is a member of the National Statistical Commission who has signed the annual report of the National Statistical Commission, says he wasn't consulted about the change of methodology. And then the Vice Chairman, who as a fellow of the Center for Policy Research before he moved to this job, had himself questioned the data of using MCA data, and saying, he had said it in as many words, that the national income or the GDP is getting overestimated by the MCA data which we are using. But when he moves from one job to the other, he is all quiet about it and continues to sit on a report, be it of unemployment data or others.
Yes, Mr. Dua. Yes. In fact, let me take that question. Let me take, let me take the question to Mr. Guruswamy. I saw your hand go up, Mr. Guruswamy. Like Mr. Dua was telling us, if 55% of the GDP number is services, and by estimate of the NSSO, 37% of that number is from dodgy companies, so is 20% of our GDP number then off the mark?
Well, possibly. And then, you have to take the informal sector into account, because even that will be deflated. And that kind of brings us to a growth rate figure which is completely different, and therefore is in consonance with the lack of jobs, with the drop in sales, with the drop in savings, with everything else. Right now, these guys are just flying. We're the fastest growing economy in the world. And we're doing 7%, 8%, whatever the mood strikes them. But none of the other data sets with it. If you're growing at 8%, you have to create jobs. Your revenues have to go up. Your sales have to go up. Fast-moving consumer goods have to go up. Automotive industry has to go up. Everything has to grow up. But nothing is growing. Everything is... Today we've got the FMCG report. 13 consecutive quarters they have contracted. The growth has contracted. Savings rate has contracted. And so, this is a process which didn't begin with these people, which began with the previous regime.
Yes.
In the last 2 years of the previous regime, you could see it tapering off. This new government came with the promise that we will set it right. Instead of setting it right, they went on trying to paper up things, and doll things up on paper to say that we are doing better, which is, this is the hoax they've been caught in. They didn't do anything about what happened earlier, and they even worsen things now by bluffing. None of this government's data is accepted now. Employment data is not accepted. Then they quote EPFO. Then they say each Mudra loan created so many jobs. It was all totally bogus. So they're living with hot air, creating data, fudging data, and hanging on. And Agarwalji, poor chap, he's clinging on to straws, saying that, if 38% of the companies are not there, then it won't affect the data, How will it not affect the data? Of course it will affect the data. So I think, we've got to sort now the damage now, which Chidambaram alluded to it. Already, if you look at the breakdown of foreign investment, only 18% of foreign investment is coming into manufacturing. Most of the money is going to buy over existing companies, where where the foreign partner is in minority, he's buying over majority, and he's putting in money in services. But 18% only is coming in manufacturing. And these gentlemen will keep shouting that foreign investment has risen to $63 billion a year. What is it coming for? Is it creating jobs? Now the challenge of this economy is a young country needs jobs. And you need to increase GDP, you need to increase revenues. Nothing is happening. And what they've borrowed money, the total borrowing of the government has doubled in the last 4 years. They've stripped ONGC clean. They've stripped all the other public sector companies. They're doing circular buying. One company buys the other company, and the government shows it as in its books.
Hey.
Yes.
Now they have laid ducks and drakes. I think they've really brought this economy to a complete.
Let's ask Mr. Agarwal this question again. Mr. Agarwal, direct question, and it's coming in from my viewers as well. Is India really the fastest growing economy of our size? Or is that something we fabricated?
No. Faye, the issue is that when the economy is growing, it has to grow because you see the macroeconomic parameters is not only the GDP growth rate that we are talking about. We are talking about the inflation is under control by up to only 4%. Fiscal deficit is under control by 3.5% of the GDP. Then FDI is coming where our stock market is in a healthy positions. So there are problems. I am not saying that there are not any problems in the economy. When we are constructing infrastructure to the tune of 37 kilometers a day national highway, 131 kilometers of rural highway, rural roadways, then airports, all these at least will create some economic activities. Banking sector has been revamped to a large extent. 11 banks had gone into a PCA. No, I am telling you the important.
Then why isn't cement industry growing?
We have to depend on data.
Why isn't cement industry growing?
Cement industry, you see, I tell you one figure. No, Mr. Guruswamy, last year, the credit offtake has grown from the banking sector to the tune of 14 to 15%. It had slowed down.
No.
But we have been able to revive it.
It has not grown.
It has contracted. Data, government spending has increased.
It has contracted for the last 5 years. It has been contracting.
You see the
so how have you been
consumption of
roads?
cement. But it is because there was a bubble was building in the housing construction areas. How that rural housing companies were being developed, the amount of bubble it was creating, that had to be broken through by RERA and other things. You have to pierce the bubble in the right time. We have taken corrected actions.
What does
and
RERA
if you
do?
have
What
to
does
question
RERA
anybody
do?
on
What to do with
the economy side, you have. No, but don't you think that there was a bubble being built in the real estate? The amount of black money getting circulated into the real estate would have created a big problem for the economy.
People were getting jobs. There was
could we have
consumption.
carried the
There was production.
banking sector with
There was
an
consumption.
NPA of
There was
Okay,
production.
hang on. You know what,
No,
one second.
Mr.
I'm going to
Guruswamy,
stop
one
you.
question
I
to
just
you.
want to read this out
Could
for
we
our
have-
audience. One second,
No,
Mr.
could we have
Agarwal.
carried
Mr. Agarwal,
away-
we've heard you out. We've
Could
heard
we
you
have
out.
carried away the banking sector?
Mr.
with a
Agarwal, you're
10%
monopolizing the conversation and that's not
NPA?
fair.
Could we
Let
have-
me just read this out. Our audience will know that the International Monetary Fund has a chief economist now of Indian origin called Geeta Gopinath. Now, Geeta Gopinath exactly a month ago made a very, very clear statement. She told a television channel a while in the US that there are some issues that need to be fixed, and we flagged this before with respect to the deflator of being used to estimate the real GDP. She pointed out that India should be more transparent when it comes to communicating data of the country. Now, this is what happens when the global market doesn't trust us. Professor Mehrotra and then Ashutosh after that. Professor Mehrotra, the arguments that were put forward by Mr. Agarwal, and every time we've had this conversation before, the government representative or the BJP representative will argue that we are the fastest growing economy. Look at the GDP. Obviously, with this much GDP, jobs will keep up. So now the GDP is in question. Where does that leave us as an economy?
Well, obviously. No, obviously the GDP has been in question even before this MCA. This is what I said. Even before this MCA fiasco, unfortunately the GDP data series was already in question, and this debate has been going on for well over 6 months. So we may well not be the fastest growing large economy of the world, which is a very important reason why jobs are not growing. I mean, we just have to recognize that. And it's interesting that Gopal Agarwal, who's a good friend, sort of was citing to us financial indicators like the inflation rate is down, like the fiscal deficit is down. But what about the real indicators of the economy? The investment rate is seriously down. One, the export to GDP ratio is actually seriously down. And in absolute value terms, exports are down. And when exports go down, then jobs that are being generated in exports are also down, because half of the exports are generated in the unorganized sector, which was attacked by the demonetization. So why are we surprised that jobs are down? It shows very clearly, incontrovertibly, that the GDP growth is nowhere close to what is being shown. Otherwise, the numbers wouldn't be being fudged in the way they are being fudged. It is tragic. It is flying in the face of facts that, jobs are down, investment is down, savings is down, exports are down, and yet the GDP is high. How can this be? It is the constituents are down, but GDP, which is supposed to be the aggregation of these constituents, is up. Is faster than ever before.
Yes.
Faster, in fact, particularly in the year of the demonetization.
Professor Mehrotra, I just want to give
world.
Ashutosh an opportunity to speak as well before we wrap this up. Ashutosh, go ahead, please.
Faye, I think I don't understand what Mr. Agarwal has been talking about the inflation. The retail inflation in the month of March was 2.86%. It's growing. And you take the example of the factory output growth, which is 0.1%, which is lowest in the last 12 months. The auto sector is completely down. The scooter sales are down. In the sales dipped in the first time in the last 12 years. And the car growth is first time takes a dip in the last five years. Now, where are the indicators? That's the question I'm asking. The point number 2, which is very, very important, is that on whose instruction these 36 companies were added for the calculation of the GDP. Is it done because there was some error, or is it done deliberately? My understanding is it is done deliberately. This is a scam, and those who have done this, they should be brought to justice.
Well, I just want to point out one thing as we wrap this up, because we've run out of time. I'm just reading right now the Financial Times, which is an international newspaper, and it has a headline that says, government agency reveals new gaps in India's GDP data. Unusual criticism adds to the suspicion that the country is trying, that Modi is trying to spin the country's statistics. And while this happens, then the international markets and the investors will also then react to these newspapers as they pick up the story. Well, this is the conversation we've been having now for the last 1 year. If jobs data shows that we have a downward trend, cars are not selling, manufacturing is down, companies tell us that they're closing or they're letting people go, how is it the GDP is still going up? Well, we might have found that solution. It turns out that the government's own report suggests that a lot of the data or the database that was being used to calculate the GDP data is not reliable or credible. More questions will need to be asked about this. Thanks for watching.